He walked into his own studio thinking he was in control until Melania Trump turned his own tactics against him, leaving him speechless on live TV. The cameras rolled and the polished set of the Spotlight Hour gleamed under the glare of studio lights. The show had built a reputation for its no-holds-barred approach, where tough questions weren't just expected, they were a spectacle. The audience, a mix of fans and skeptics, sat on the edge of their seats waiting for the night's main event. At the center of it all sat Melania Trump. Dressed in an elegant, understated silk blouse and perfectly tailored trousers, she looked every bit as composed as she had during her time in the White House. Her posture was flawless, her expression neutral but unreadable. A woman who had spent years being analyzed, criticized, admired, and underestimated. Yet still no one seemed to truly understand her. Across from her, the host adjusted his earpiece, flashed a knowing smirk, and leaned back in his chair with an air of casual confidence. He was a media veteran, a man who had built his brand on exposing public figures, baiting them into viral sound bites. He had sparred with politicians, actors, and CEOs, always pushing the line between journalism and provocation. And tonight he was ready to poke the bear. The opening minutes of the interview were routine, almost rehearsed. Questions about her post-White House life, her initiatives, her time as First Lady. Melania responded with the same measured tone she had always used, giving just enough to answer, but never enough to be dissected. But something in the room shifted. The host's smile was just a little too tight, his laughter a little too forced. His audience could sense it. He was waiting for the moment to take control, to flip the narrative. To turn Melania Trump into just another guest who had walked into his arena unprepared. And yet, as the conversation continued, something wasn't going according to plan. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't flustered. In fact, she wasn't giving him much to work with at all. That's when his tactics changed. He sat forward, elbows resting on the glossy desk between them, his expression sharpening. The charm faded ever so slightly. And in its place came something far more familiar. Condescension. Melania noticed it immediately. She had been here before. Different faces, different settings, same strategy. They came at her with a polished arrogance, convinced that they had already figured her out. They framed her as a passive observer in her own story, as if she had merely stood beside power rather than held her own within it. She had played this game before, the host smirked. He thought she didn't see what was coming, but she did. The host tapped his fingers against the desk, his smirk growing just a little wider. He had spent years perfecting his approach, slowly tightening the net around his guests, luring them into a false sense of control before delivering the blow that would send social media into a frenzy. He adjusted his suit jacket, took a breath, and went in. "So, Melania," he started, drawing out her name with deliberate ease. "Now that you've had some time away from Washington, what's life like? I imagine it must be nice to finally relax." A simple enough question on the surface. But the way he said it, like she had spent her years in the White House lounging around, left a bitter taste in the air. Melania didn't blink. She nodded slightly, choosing her words with precision. "I focus on my work, my initiatives, my family." Her accent, smooth and deliberate, made every syllable land exactly where she wanted it. The host gave a slow nod, pretending to consider her answer. Right be best, wasn't it?" He chuckled under his breath, just enough for the audience to hear. "That was your anti-bullying campaign." The way he phrased it wasn't outright disrespectful, but the audience caught on. The undertone was clear. That little thing. Melania's face remained unreadable. The host continued, shifting in his seat. "I have to ask though," he said, tilting his head. "Looking back, do you think it really made an impact? I mean, let's be honest, there were a lot of people who didn't quite get it." A few muffled chuckles rippled through the audience. The host's specialty was making statements sound like innocent observations, even when they carried sharp edges. He wasn't outright insulting her, but he was daring her to take offense. Melania exhaled softly. She had dealt with this before. Still, the host wasn't done. He leaned forward now, sensing an opportunity. "Some people felt it was ironic given, well, certain figures in your circle," he said with a sly smile. The audience knew exactly what he meant. A louder chuckle, a few scattered claps. The moment stretched. Most guests at this point would have shifted in their seats, glanced at the camera, laughed nervously, or offered some vague diplomatic response. But Melania did none of that. Instead, she remained perfectly still, watching him with the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable. The host hesitated just for a fraction of a second. She had seen the tactic before, laugh it off, let the audience take the cue to mock, and once the subject was softened up, deliver the real hit. And then it came. The host tilted his head, eyes gleaming. I mean, let's be real, Melania. You were first lady, but you weren't exactly out there, were you? The audience chuckled again, louder this time. The words were meant to sound like a joke, but they weren't. They were calculated, carefully chosen to frame her as decorative, to diminish her. Melania's fingers twitched slightly against her lap, not in discomfort, in calculation, because she knew exactly what she was about to do. And the host had no idea what was coming. The audience was still chuckling when the host went in for the kill. You know, he said, tapping his pen against the desk. I think a lot of people just didn't quite see you. You weren't as, how do I put this, present as some of the other first ladies. The implication hung heavy in the air. Melania remained still, her breathing steady, her expression neutral. But behind those sharp blue eyes, something shifted. The host saw her silence as hesitation, as if she was unsure of how to respond. He mistook her stillness for weakness, a mistake many had made before. He smiled, pressing forward. It's just that when people think of first ladies, they think of Eleanor Roosevelt, Michelle Obama, even Hillary Clinton, he said, his voice light, conversational but cutting like a blade. Women who were visible, active, engaged. The audience rumbled. Some nodded, others murmured. A few smirked, enjoying the tension. The host leaned back, crossing his arms. I mean, tell me, do you ever feel like maybe you could have done more? There it was, the line that turned the room into a pressure cooker. He had worded it perfectly, couched in faux curiosity, wrapped in just enough plausible deniability to make it seem like an innocent question. But it wasn't innocent. It was an insult, a dismissal, a framing of her as an accessory rather than a force in her own right. The camera panned to Melania. The audience had seen her quiet composure before, but this moment was different. There was something calculating in her silence. Now for the first time the host hesitated. Something was coming and it would change everything. The air in the studio shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The kind of silence that comes just before a storm. Melania Trump, still poised, finally moved. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to let the host know she had heard him, not just his words but the intent behind them. And then, with the kind of measured control that only comes from years of being under scrutiny, she spoke. Let me ask you something, she said, her voice even unshaken. You say people didn't see me, but tell me. What is it that you think you saw? The host blinked just once. Melania didn't wait for him to respond. I was First Lady of the United States. I represented this country across the world. I visited hospitals, schools, communities in crisis. I met with leaders, with families who had lost everything. And yet, because I did not perform for the cameras the way you wanted, you say I was not present. Her tone never wavered. It didn't need to. The audience was no longer laughing. The host opened his mouth as if to interject, but Melania continued, her voice steady and deliberate. I understand why you ask this question. It is easier to reduce people to images. To make a person into a headline, a sound bite. That is your business, no? The words weren't harsh, but they were surgical. She was peeling him apart in real time. The host shifted in his chair. The easy confidence he had worn so well at the beginning of the interview was cracking just slightly. Melania leaned forward now, resting her forearms on the chair. The movement was subtle, but it was a shift in control. You think I should have done more? She asked, holding his gaze. But tell me, how much is enough for you? The host swallowed. Melania let the question linger. In America, she continued, her voice soft but firm. We say we believe in strength, in privacy, in dignity. But when a woman does not perform the way you expect, when she does not shout to prove herself, you say she is not there. The camera caught the host's expression. He wasn't smiling anymore. Melania sat back, smoothing an invisible crease from her blouse. I have been many things, she said. But I have never been invisible, and that is why we are sitting here today. No, a beat, then applause. It started slow, hesitant, but then it grew. Some audience members clapped, others cheered. It was unclear if they even knew why they were doing it. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of what they had just witnessed. Maybe it was because they had felt the shift happen in real time. The host exhaled, forcing a chuckle, trying to regain control. But the moment had already passed. The interview had changed. Melania Trump had just flipped the script and there was no going back. The tension in the room was undeniable. The host, who had spent years controlling the narrative, suddenly found himself at a loss. He shifted in his seat, forcing a smile, but it lacked the usual confidence. He glanced toward the audience as if looking for an ally. But the reaction was not what he had expected. The applause hadn't stopped. A few in the front row leaned forward, eyes locked on Melania, as if waiting to see what she'd do next. Others whispered to one another, no longer amused by the host's usual tricks. The energy had shifted. The audience wasn't with him anymore and he knew it. Still he tried to recover. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Well, he said, grasping for control. I wasn't saying you were invisible, Melania, just that, well, people might have expected a little more, but it was weak and Melania knew it. She allowed a small, knowing smile, not one of amusement but of understanding. She had played this game before. The host cleared his throat, trying again. People just... Melania raised a hand slightly, silencing him without saying a word. I know what you mean, she said. You think I should have shouted more? Demanded more attention. She let her words hang for a second before continuing. But I do not shout to be seen, and I do not need your approval to know my worth. The audience erupted. This time it wasn't polite applause. It was a statement. The host's jaw tensed. He forced a laugh, but it was hollow. He had lost control, and now he had to sit in the very spotlight he had set up for his guest. The interview wasn't going how he had planned. The cameras were still rolling and the energy in the room had completely flipped. This was supposed to be an easy moment. Another clip for his highlight reel, another viral takedown of a public figure. But instead he was the one being picked apart, exposed. He looked at his notes, searching for a way out, something to pivot to. But what do you do when the guest has already taken over the room? The studio lights suddenly felt hotter. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. And social media? Oh, they were about to have a field day. By the time the interview ended, the damage was done. The cameras cut, the stage crew moved in, and the host gave his usual polite handshake. But everyone in that studio knew what had just happened. This wasn't just another talk show moment. This was something else. Within minutes, the first clips hit social media. Melania Trump just flipped the script on this host and I'm here for it. She didn't raise her voice once, not once, and he fell apart. Say what you want about her, but this was the most composed destruction I've ever seen. It didn't take long before mainstream news outlets picked it up. Headlines flooded the internet. Melania Trump stuns TV host with unexpected response. I do not need your approval. Melania fires back live on air. Watch TV host left speechless after Melania Trump's icy response. The clip replayed on every major news station. Pundits analyzed her tone, her word choices, the sheer confidence in her delivery. Some defended her. She's been underestimated for years, one commentator said. This moment proves she was always in control. Others tried to downplay it. Let's not act like this was some great takedown, a critic scoffed. She just dodged the question like any other politician. But it didn't matter what side people were on. Everyone was talking about it. By the next morning, Melania's response had been viewed millions of times across platforms. Twitter threads broke down every second of the exchange. Body language experts weighed in on how the host's demeanor shifted when he realized he was losing ground. Memes flooded the internet. One of the most viral? A side-by-side clip. 1 second, the host smugly leading the conversation. The next, his face slowly falling as he realizes he's lost control. The caption, when you think you're setting the trap but you're actually in it. Meanwhile, the host. He stayed quiet. No tweets, no statements, no attempts to spin the moment. Because what could he say? He had walked into his own studio thinking this was just another night, another guest, another chance to play the game. Instead, he became the story. By the end of the week, the dust hadn't settled. If anything, the debate had only grown louder. Some called it a lesson in composure, a master class in how to handle condescension without losing control. Others saw it as a reckoning, a shift in how Melania Trump was perceived. For years she had been dismissed, reduced to a public figure standing in someone else's shadow. But not anymore. Political analysts debated the long-term impact. Would this moment redefine her legacy? Did it expose the media's double standards? Some of the same voices who had mocked her for years were suddenly forced to acknowledge something they had refused to before. She was never as fragile as they made her out to be. But beyond the headlines and the Twitter debates, something deeper was at play. This moment resonated because it wasn't just about Melania Trump. It was about every person who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or underestimated. Every woman who had ever been told she needed to be louder, more aggressive, more visible, just to be taken seriously. Melania didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't scramble to defend herself. She owned the moment without ever raising her voice. And that's what people remembered. The host? He'd move on. He'd interview someone else next week, pretend like it never happened. But no matter how many guests sat across from him in that chair, no one would forget the night he lost control of his own show. In a world that demands you prove yourself louder, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay composed and let your presence speak for itself. Let this be a reminder. Strength isn't about volume, it's about control. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. Because some moments deserve to be remembered.